Good morning. So this quarter we've been looking at Messianic prophecy, and we spent a couple of weeks on the Psalms because the Psalms are a real focus of Messianic prophecy. And then we moved on to the prophets because that's the other real treasure trove of prophecy, of course. And this is our second of 2 weeks on Isaiah. Isaiah has a lot of important Messianic prophecies. Last week we looked at several of those, and today we're going to look at just two of the most important passages from Isaiah concerning the Messiah. The first one is one that we read a lot at the Lord's table. One of the famous servant songs. It's often call it the suffering servant passage from Isaiah. We often read from Isaiah chapter 53, but it really begins with the last three verses of Isaiah chapter 52. And we'll just read that out loud and then look back at some of the key verses. Starting in Isaiah 52, verse 13. My servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and greatly exalted. Just as many were appalled at you, his appearance was so disfigured that he did not look like a man, and his form did not resemble a human being. So he will cleanse many nations. Kings will shut their mouths because of him, for they will see what had not been told them, and they will understand what they had not heard. Who has believed what we have heard? And whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed to? He grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or splendor that we should look at him, no appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of suffering who knew what sickness was. He was like one people turned away from. He was despised, and we didn't value him. Yet he himself bore our sicknesses, and he carried our pains. But we, in turn, regarded him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced because of our transgressions, crushed because of our iniquities. Punishment for our peace was on him, and we are healed by his wounds. We all went astray like sheep. We all have turned to our own way, and the Lord has punished him for the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, like a sheep silent before her shearers, he did not open his mouth. He was taken away because of oppression and judgment. And who considered his fate? For he was cut off from the land of the living. He was struck because of my people's rebellion. They made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man at his death. Although he had done no violence and had not spoken deceitfully, yet the Lord was pleased to crush him, and he made him sick. When you make him a restitution offering, he will see his seed. He will prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will succeed by his hand. He will see it out of his anguish, and he will be satisfied with his knowledge. My righteous servant will justify many, and he will carry their iniquities. Therefore I will give him the many as a portion, and he will receive the mighty as spoil, because he submitted himself to death and was counted among the rebels. Yet he bore the sin of many and interceded for the rebels. So let's take a look back at some of this. This is the fourth of the so-called servant songs of Isaiah. We looked at the other three previously. This is perhaps the most inspiring Messianic prophecy. It's the one that we as Christians tend to read most often out of all the servant songs, out of all Messianic prophecies. It's written in 5 stanzas, basically, or strophes, each of which is 3 verses. There's the 3 verses at the end of chapter 52, and then there's 4 groups of 3 in chapter 53. And the very first one, we'll just take them one stanza at a time. And we have kind of a theme that scholars have named for many of these stanzas. The first theme is mystery. The suffering servant gets introduced with some contrasts that are rather mysterious. Verse 13 exalts him, and then verse 14 says his appearance is so marred as to not appear human, which as Christians we recognize as referring to someone who's been beaten severely. But then in the very next verse, verse 15, somehow he awes the kings of all the nations of the world. So this is a very strange contrast for a Jew to be reading and trying to figure out how is this going to happen. And scholars have said that verse 14 deals with his first coming, his sufferings, his beatings, the marring of his appearance so that he doesn't even look human. And then verse 15 is predicting his second coming, when he is glorified before all the nations of the world, and all shall bow down to him. Now the next stanzas, the first 3 verses of chapter 53, and there the theme is rejection, the rejection of the Messiah. And he puts guilt, Isaiah's words put guilt on the entire nation, all of the Jewish people. We rejected him. We were the ones who rejected the suffering servant. The language is that he is not much to look on, and he had no form or splendor that we should look at him, no appearance that we should desire him. And before that it said he grew up like a root out of dry ground. It's like he's not from any place special, and he also doesn't look like anything special. He didn't grow up in some wonderful place. He doesn't even come from Jerusalem. And he doesn't look like some royalty. He's not born as a prince or something like that in this world. He's rejected, despised. He's turned into the man of sorrows or man of suffering, depending on what translation you have. So the theme is prophesying the rejection of the Messiah. Then we get the next stanza, verses 4 through 6. Here now the theme switches to atonement. Starts out emphasizing our lack of understanding. Collectively, we considered that he must be suffering because he deserved it. At the time that Jesus is carried off to be crucified, it's shameful. And the feeling in most ancient cultures, as we saw with the friends of Job in the book of Job, is you must have had it coming. If you're suffering, you must deserve it. You must be rejected by God. Job's friends said, you must have secret sins that have brought this on you. And he's saying that many of the people at the time of the suffering servant are going to look at him and say, he's been smitten by God. Picture the people at the cross mocking Jesus and saying, well, if he's the Son of God, let God bring him down off the cross. Ha ha ha, And if God doesn't immediately bring him down off the cross, well, then that must prove what? God has rejected him. He's being punished by God. Verse 5 re-emphasizes something very important. He did not suffer for his own sins. He suffered for our sins. And verse 6 has important language because a lot of the language of the Old Testament deals with the Jewish nation, the Jewish people, the nation of Israel collectively. And when a number of people have gone into idolatry, then collectively they get punished, right? And even some of the innocent, like Daniel and his friends, get carried off into captivity. There's a very collective dealing with the people of Israel. But verse 6 says that each of us went astray like sheep. Not just, most of us or something. Every person is a sinner. Every person needs the suffering servant to die for taking away every person's sin. It's an individual thing now, too. We all went astray like sheep, and we each have turned to our own way. And the Lord has punished him for the iniquity of us all. The next stanza emphasizes the submission. All of this terrible suffering isn't against the will of the suffering servant. The suffering servant is going along with it. He's offering himself up for punishment. He submits to God's will. He doesn't cry out. This is emphasized more than once in this one stanza. He doesn't cry out like a sheep who's being taken to be sheared. He doesn't open his mouth. And of course, when we read about Jesus, what happens when he's put on trial? Does he fight? Does he speak up in his own defense and say, wait a minute, let me prove to you that I'm innocent? And in fact, Pilate was amazed. He said to Jesus, don't you know, the power I have? Don't you know that I could help? And you sit there and you don't answer? Pilate was amazed at that. If you're a government official and you've ever dealt in Roman times with someone who's on trial, you probably never experienced someone who refused to defend themselves. Everyone who's accused and who might be subject to execution is going. Well, we need batteries, I'm afraid. But Jesus did not, and this was all prophesied of him. And then verse 9 has this very strange contrast. They made his They even sped up people's deaths on the cross, right? By breaking their legs so that they would suffocate faster. It turns out when you're in that position for hours, you get to where you can't even breathe. You can't even work the diaphragm. And so people who were crucified would push up off of their feet, as painful as that was, and it would help them to breathe for a little bit. But then you would wear yourself out pushing up, and they would come and just break the legs severely so you couldn't even push up anymore. At a certain point, a day or two had gone by and they had made enough of an example out of you, and so they would do that. How could you be dead already? But Pilate confirmed from the soldiers, yes, he's dead, and said to Joseph of Arimathea, okay, then you can take the body off. And he was buried in a rich man's tomb, even though he had been killed with the wicked. So verse 9 has this what was probably very mysterious at the time Isaiah wrote it, prophecy. Very mysterious contrast. And then we get the final stanza, the final 3 verses of chapter 53. And now, somehow, he's dead, he's been killed with the wicked. What's left? Somehow, after being killed, exaltation is what is left. In verse 10, it uses phrases that the Hebrews used for, may you have a long life. May you see your offspring and your grandkids, and that kind of phrasing. That's applied now to the suffering servant in verse 10, even though he's dead. He's already been killed in the previous stanza. So what does that mean? God has already allowed him to die, and he died willingly, but now it says God's going to prolong his days. Well, as Christians, it's easy for us to solve that puzzle, right? How can that be possible? It's the resurrection. And it's also interesting the word that's used in verse 11. He will justify many and carry their iniquities. This word justified is translated into Greek in the Septuagint. It's the same word that Paul uses when he teaches the doctrine of justification, like in the book of Romans. In Romans chapter 4, we have one of the most important passages of Paul concerning the doctrine of justification by faith. To be justified was a legal term, meaning you're declared innocent. But how can a sinner be declared innocent? Only by being cleansed, by having someone else take your punishment for you. And in Romans chapter 4, Paul gives the important teaching that it's a gift. If you earned it, you would consider it like a worker receiving his wages. When I go work and my employer gives me a paycheck, I don't treat it like a gift. He's obligated. He has to give me my wages. But that's not how Paul describes salvation. When we receive salvation, we're thankful that we've received a gift. We don't say, well, sure, I earned it. Give it to me, And in that process, in chapters 4, 5, 6, Paul uses the word justification. And that the word justify is used here in Isaiah. And then in the very last verse, the language of a conqueror being given the spoils is used. How is he a conqueror? because he submitted himself to death and was counted among the rebels. That's an odd way to become a conqueror. Seems to be the opposite of conquering anything. Yet he bore the sin of many and interceded for the rebels. Did Jesus intercede for rebels that he was crucified with? Yes. He said, not only did he say in general of those who were tormenting him, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing, but he interceded for the rebel who repented. Today you'll be with me in paradise. So this is really an amazing passage from these 15 verses from Isaiah, because they contain so much detail that applies to Jesus, and that it would be really hard for a Jewish reader before the time of Jesus to fully understand how is all that going to happen with the suffering, with the Messiah. And I mentioned at the beginning of this series that it was so difficult for Jews to understand how the king language, the new high priest language, the new prophet like Moses language, and the suffering servant language could all apply to one person. And so some of the rabbis began to teach, and in particular, with respect to the suffering servant, that maybe it's not all one person. Maybe the suffering servant is someone who comes along with the Messiah, and he gets sacrificed, because it's just really hard to see. If you're the victorious king, how can you be the suffering servant who gets killed? But there's no escaping it, because right here in this suffering servant passage, we have this language of the conqueror at the end of the passage, and it says, because he submitted himself to death and was counted among the rebels. That's why he's going to be treated by God as a conqueror and given the spoils. So even if you lived before the time of Christ and didn't fully understand it, you really shouldn't be thinking, he can't be the conquering king, because if he were, he wouldn't die. Right here in Isaiah it says, the one that God declares as the conqueror is the one who's going to die with the rebels. Now, the other passage we want to deal with is the good news, the passage. And in Greek, we derive the word gospel from the good news. But rather than read it from Isaiah, I'm going to let Jesus read it. In the last part of Isaiah, we mentioned last week, there are different themes. In the first half of Isaiah, the Messianic passages kind of have the theme of Jesus as king. And then we get the servant passages, of which there are 4 servant songs, and the suffering servant passage is the last one of those. But then in the last quarter of Isaiah, the theme is Messiah the conqueror. And this is the most famous of the conqueror passages. It says the Messiah is the proclaimer of good news, the gospel. And if we look early in Jesus' ministry, Luke chapter 4, I think we can get the best reading of this in context. We'll start in verse 16. He came to Nazareth where he had been brought up. As usual, he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. Now, we believe that at this time you needed to be a 30-year-old man or older to even read a scripture, because the way they taught, as opposed to our sermons, was more of an interactive. Someone gets up and reads the passage for the day, and then when he's done, he makes comments, and then other people would discuss. So during the portion of the synagogue that kind of corresponds to the sermon, it was actually a discussion. And it's Jesus' turn to read a passage, and when he finishes reading, he's supposed to say something to start the discussion. It says, the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. And unrolling the scroll, he found the place where it was written. And this is Isaiah chapter 61. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. He then rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. This is how they taught also. They read it out loud, and then you sat down on a stool for the discussion part that he would lead. And the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fixed on him. So what's he going to say about the passage? He began by saying to them, today, as you listen, this scripture has been fulfilled. Very dramatic. Jesus is well aware this is a Messianic passage. This was one of the passages that Jews studied and said, when the Messiah comes, this will apply to him. This is how he will teach us. He'll proclaim the good news and he will liberate. He'll liberate the blind and the oppressed and the captives. And Jesus sits up before them and says, that's me. This passage is fulfilled right now. I'm proclaiming the good news. In other words, I'm the Messiah. He's proclaiming the Messiah. They were all amazed, but some of them started to say, isn't this just Joseph's son? We know who this guy is. He's a human being, and he's from our area, he's from our town, and it's kind of hard to believe that the Messiah is just the son of a carpenter from Nazareth, isn't it, when you live in Nazareth? Shouldn't he be like a prince from Jerusalem or something? And I've always wondered, when somebody gets famous, if somebody gets to be president of the United States or whatever, if all the people who went to elementary school with him are saying, are you kidding? That guy? Because it's just, if you ever know somebody, it's just hard to believe, isn't it, that they ever do something. And here's Jesus, the carpenter's son from Nazareth. And he's sitting here saying, I'm the Messiah, basically, in so many words. And that's what his words mean. And that's just extremely dramatic, but also it's a challenge to those people. Now they're going to have to observe him and decide, does that seem to be true? Let's watch his ministry and find out, if that's true. And some of them will conclude that it was true, and some will conclude otherwise. Thank you for your time. Next week we'll move on to some of the later prophets.